So, among the many significant things that have occurred in the past 20 years, the first and foremost one that comes to mind actually occurs over the course of a week, and obviously even that week is in a broader context, but it was a week in which the state of New Jersey was getting closer, but still a ways off from marriage equality. And I asked the board at a board meeting one month if we might put a sign out in front of the congregation. Sabina von Alek was the president at the time. And I asked if we might put a sign on the building that said that we here stand for marriage equality. And that was back when our name was the Unitarian Church. And so the board voted to do that. And then on that Sunday morning, that next Sunday morning, the board joined me here on the chancel, and we asked for any gay and lesbian couples who might be in the congregation to come up, and the board asked them to come and stand with the board and me on the side of love, on the side of marriage equality, and then we asked the congregation to stand with us. And at that point, Artis Wodehouse was our music director at the time, and Artis began playing Standing on the Side of Love. And so the chancel was filled with the Board of Trustees and with Judy Tomlinson and me and with a number of gay and lesbian couples who happened to be in the house that day, as we all sang Standing on the Side of Love, and we dedicated that banner that hung out on the building for the next 4 to 5 years until marriage equality was achieved. But that Sunday morning, there wasn't a dry eye in the house as we all stood together on the side of love, and it was just one of those very amazing experiences. Another one that comes to mind, again in this room, goes all the way back to when I was called to be the minister here. I had finished the 8-day week of candidating and preached the second Sunday and went up to the office to wait while the congregation held the congregational meeting and voted to call me as minister. And when I came back, we had done only one service that day, and so extra chairs were put up, and it was a challenge to get up to the chancel from the back of the room, and there were chairs set up in the narthex as well. And I think that David Lewis had arranged for the congregation to sing me back into the sanctuary as I came back, as they brought me back from over in the office. And it was one of the highlights of my life as I walked through the room and everyone was singing, and Nancy Knurtzer was waiting in the pulpit for me, and she said something like it was like a 99% vote or something like that. And so then when the noise in the room calmed down, she said, that the congregational vote had occurred and that the congregation had overwhelmingly voted to call me as its minister. Would I accept that call? And at that point, of course, I had to say, well, let me think about it for a minute. And I said, well, of course, I would be honored and privileged to accept that call. And it was just, the spirit in the room was utterly phenomenal, as it so often is in this room.
Not to go back and forth so much, but could you tell a story about when the banner came down?
Okay, so the way that the banner came down from the building, on that week, on Monday of the week that it came down, and I won't be able to come up with the exact dates for you, but on the Monday of that week, the appellate court had decided that marriage equality would be the law in the state of New Jersey, and that immediately couples would be able to apply for marriage licenses and be married. And so I was out riding my bicycle, and I happened to check my telephone, and received word of that while I was riding on my bicycle. So then I come back and we start our week here on Tuesdays, and we begin the week with staff meeting on Tuesday. And so I announced to the staff that everything was going to be different at the worship service the following Sunday. And immediately we contacted all the former presidents that had been part of that journey toward the moment of legalizing marriage equality in the state, and we created a worship service. We held, again, only one service that day. The room was packed. We had the facilities manager take the banner down, and we had the children of the congregation parade in with the banner in a magnificent ceremony. And I believe we were singing "Standing on the Side of Love" again as they brought it in. And then we had either each of the presidents that had been involved or a video clip that they had made that week in telling that history. And it was just a phenomenal celebration. I don't know if you remember, but in between those events, there was the first Supreme Court case in which the Supreme Court took a step back in making their judgment, and the step back was to say that there could be no discrimination against gay and lesbian couples, that they had to receive all the rights and benefits of marriage, of heterosexual marriage, in that Supreme Court case, and they left it up to the legislature to make that occur. And then the legislature demurred, and they created civil unions, which was something of a travesty, but which is why it was eventually done away with. We should probably talk about that process too in a few minutes. But the night of the Supreme Court decision, we met in this space, and the overflow crowd filled Fletcher Hall, and so we had it taped in both places. And Steve Goldberg was the head of marriage equality for the state of New Jersey at that time. What was the name? Steve Goldstein, I'm sorry.
I'll say that again, just as Steve Goldstein.
Stephen Goldstein is not Steve. Stephen Goldstein was the head of Garden State Equality, and this room was packed. People were nearly hanging from the rafters. Fletcher Hall was filled, and we piped the sound into there. There was press from all over the world. Telemundo was here, and there was press from everywhere. We had this enormous event, and the following day, across the country, in newspapers across the country and on websites, Steve Goldstein and I were standing and hugging right here in this spot. It was in the St. Louis paper, it was in the Seattle, Washington paper, it was all up and down the East Coast, it was in Des Moines, Iowa, it was all over the place. So part of the marriage equality process, and I consider this to be a congregational part of it, even though I was the one whose face was at the front of it, was that I was called by Governor Cody while he was filling in for Governor Corzine. Governor Cody called me and asked me to be his gubernatorial representative on the gubernatorial commission to study the civil union law. And the task of the commission was to determine if the mandates of the civil union law were being achieved, and B, if even with the mandates being achieved, if they were, would it be possible for the civil union law to achieve what had been mandated by the Supreme Court, and that in fact gay and lesbian couples would have the same rights and benefits that heterosexual couples had in this state. And it was a commission that had been impaneled for a 3-year period. We ended up finishing our work in 2 years' time. We held hearings all over the state, and then continued our work in Trenton on a regular basis, either twice or once monthly. We would meet, and what we discovered was what one might have expected that we would. That first of all, that the laws as they had been stipulated by the legislature were not being met, but that our investigations through in-state and out-of-state exploration showed that even if they were met, it could not achieve the mandate of the Supreme Court. What's interesting is that when we tendered our final report, it was immediately shelved by both the governor and by the legislature, and they didn't use it to bring about marriage equality. But the state of California and a number of other states cited our report, the commission's report from New Jersey, in legalizing marriage equality in those states. And another significant moment, which was probably a defining moment, I think, in my ministry here, was September 11th, 2001. The towers were hit and collapsed in the morning, and within very little time, I recognized that we needed to have some kind of worshipful event that evening, and we began letting people know. Jerry, you and Karen came into my office that day, and we talked about what was going on and how we might begin to try to make sense of it, although on that particular day it was awfully early to make any sense out of anything. But I will not forget that night when we put together a worship service that had a great deal of song and some readings, and I prepared a short message. And the place filled up, and what I remember from that night was the power that was generated in this room by people coming to their religious home in order to gain a sense of finding themselves on that day when so much was lost.
Many people from the community also who were looking for something. So
that happened on the following Sunday more, and I'll talk about that in a moment too. But on the night of September 11th, it was mostly our community, mostly our congregation that came. There were people from the community, but it was primarily members of our congregation who were here, and people that I know were in the neighborhood of the World Trade Center. People I know who made it back across the Hudson River by helter-skelter. People who got to this side of the river and were hosed off by fire hoses, and people who had been through hell that day personally in the midst of that experience, and then the rest of us who had been through hell that day because here we were on that day. And the thing that was a miracle to me that day was watching the people come in for that 7 o'clock in the evening service, just rounded shoulders and sagging heads and sagging bodies and just struggling to be. And when we left, we went out and we sang our final song out on the front lawn. And as people walked out to do that, shoulders were back and squared a bit more, and heads were being held just a little bit higher, and it just felt like the community had come together in a way that it allowed itself to serve itself. People came, and in serving the others who were here, were served, and it was phenomenal.
Yeah, so that seemed to have had an effect for a long time in the congregation.
It did.
Do you want to talk a little?
Well, just then that following Sunday, our normal attendance on Sundays has ranged off and on through the years, but in those days, not too different from now, but in those days, we would have maybe 150 or so people on a Sunday morning at the second service, and maybe around 80 or so people at the first service, 80 to 100 people at the first service. On that following Sunday, between the two services, there were 1,500 people who were here for the worship service. Not just did our congregation need to find a place where they could draw strength. But the people from the broader community who did not have religious congregations to turn to came here, and they were here with us. And, you know, it was enormous on that next Sunday. Again, we were set up in Fletcher Hall again, and that was the case for the next 2, 3, 4 Sundays after that, as this became kind of a central place for people to come to find comfort and strength in a time of distress. Because there's really one more fundamental event that is essential in the shaping of our shared ministry, I think. And what that was the creation of our after-school program. You know, back in 1997, Bill Brock and Frank Rennie had this dream of creating an after-school program for students of Hillside School just up the street who would, in the 3rd grade, be identified as being at risk, and we would bring them into our facilities. We would have tutors for them, and we would try to make a difference in their academic lives that might provide for a difference in their future lives. And the program began all these many years later. It is still going strong. It's now run by Pete Williams, and in my mind, it's that program, as well as there's so many fundamental pieces, Jerry. That program has, I think, kept the congregation very honestly connected to its roots and to its mission in ways that other programs can't possibly.
Because it's mentoring as well as education.
It's mentoring as well as education, and it is rooted in relationship. You know, and those are key things. One other fundamental piece that I forgot that is huge, but you know, we get used to these things and we don't think of them necessarily in their very origin. But we went from having a director of religious education many years ago to having a minister of religious education, and recognized that the religious education of our children is a core element of the ministry of this congregation. And so we have had ministry and professional ministry in the leadership of that program ever since. So that's been for the past now 15 years, and that's essential in terms of who the congregation is and a part of this ministry that we've shared over these years, over these score of years. You know, what I would want people to know about the role that the congregation has played in fulfilling our mission. Our mission is to be a liberal religious community seeking transformation in our hearts, our homes, our community, and our world. And the way that this congregation has served both by being the people power and by being the place, the way the congregation has served in transforming our community has been incredible over the years. You know, I'll leave it to the students of history to find before my tenure here, and there are great records of that. But just during my tenure here, I mean, one of the really huge things that was going on when I arrived was the Undoing Racism Committee. Had been very active for maybe 3 or 4 years, and they were bringing in the People's Institute. And in my first year here, the People's Institute were brought in by our Undoing Racism Committee. One of their 3-day workshops occurred, and you know, people in attendance of that were not just members of this congregation. The mayor of Montclair was there, and that mayor was not Jerry Freed, but a previous mayor of Montclair. There were 2 or 3 of the council members that were there. The chief of police was there. You know, we were having an impact on the way that the town of Montclair understood the role of race and the dynamics of civility here. You know, we helped the larger community to understand that racism was woven into the fabric of our society, and that if we were not paying attention to those threads in that fabric, we were supporting them and we were providing continuity for them. And that's what the Undoing Racism Committee did. Another piece that was going on was that the congregation was in the final steps of completing the Welcoming Congregation program, a program of the Unitarian Universalist Association, the UUA, in which the congregation really did a lot of self-exploration, again, looking to see where individuals and the congregation helped to maintain homophobia so that we could learn to work against it. And that was all going on. Okay, so let me tell you why I chose to come to Montclair. You know, I can't answer why Montclair chose to call me, but I can tell folks about why I chose to come to Montclair. At the time, in 1995, I was in conversation with 7 other congregations about being their candidates at various points in the process. And when I was first asked about Montclair, I said, oh no, I certainly don't want to be that close to the city of New York. And then when the chair of the search committee, Diane Connell, who I will be meeting with later today, by the way, called me and asked me if I would be interested, I said, well, I will certainly look at it. You know, please send me your packet, I'll send you mine. And so when I got the packet and saw the incredible history of involvement of the congregation, I was incredibly impressed. And what impressed me was that I saw an alignment between my social justice history and this congregation's social justice history. And I wanted to be, I thought, with a congregation that took social justice as seriously as I do as a part of their religious life. And so I said, yes, I would be interested in being part of the conversation with you. And in the end, I said, no, thank you to all of those other congregations, and yes, please, to Montclair. And the reason was because, A, I knew that in Montclair, with the level of involvement and the level of expertise and artistry of the people here, that I would be called every day to be the best minister that I could be. And second, that, you know, this marriage of ministry in a congregation that understood and required social justice as a part of who they are. And so I said, yes, give me that, please. And it's been the case ever since. I'd like to talk for a moment or two about the shared ministry of the congregation. One of the changes that I sought and we made when I first got here was changing something that had been called the Ministerial Relations Committee to a Committee on Ministry. And now that Committee on Ministry has become the Council on Ministry. And when it was the Ministerial Relations Committee, it was a group of people that were chosen by both the minister and the congregation in order to serve as a kind of a go-between the congregation and the minister in terms of the relationship, because the minister in our kind of polity, of congregational polity, doesn't have a boss. I'm called by the congregation. I can be dismissed only by the congregation, and since that conversation would be an awfully large and unwieldy one, the way that we stay in relationship is via that mechanism of that committee. But in the work associational work that I was doing prior to coming here, I was very involved in changing the way the congregations viewed the work of that committee and the relationship between minister and congregation. And so we began having a committee on ministry, and that committee on ministry was tasked with assessing the various levels of of ministry within the congregation, as well as the professional ministry. And so the way that we do that is, you know, what is our ministry? What is our shared ministry? Everything that any of us do towards the fulfillment of our covenant is that shared ministry. So our covenant, transformation of our hearts, our homes, our community, and our world. Any of the work that we do, whether it be building maintenance and grounds maintenance, that supports that work, that's ministry. Whether that be greeting people in the narthex as they come in, whether that be serving coffee, whether that be working in the archive room, whatever work is done to support this congregation and to support the programs of this congregation is the ministry. So the Committee on Ministry, now the Council on Ministry, is tasked with monitoring and reporting on the health of those ministries wherever they are, as well as the health of the professional ministry, now with 2 professional ministers. Another shift in the way that we've been doing religious life in our congregation was a shift that we made 4 years ago now, from having Judy Tomlinson's title being the Minister of Religious Education to being Associate Minister. She hasn't lost religious education from her portfolio, but some very vital aspects of congregational life have been added to that. I call her our Minister of Infrastructure. And so what falls under her ministry at this point includes our covenant group ministries. Our covenant group ministries, which allow for small groups to provide the very essential close relationships that people come into larger congregations to find. We say that in our covenant groups, people are here to find the intimate while exploring the ultimate, and that has changed the way I think we do congregation, because there is an ethos now of that small group involvement, and it permeates well beyond those covenant groups. We look at ministries in other ways. We have a music ministry now, as well, with Marcus Gray Hauk as our music minister. And I'm going out of order, but to go back to the infrastructure pieces of it, another aspect of it that comes under Judy's title is the membership committee, which is something we have stepped up to and stepped back away from so many times over the years, but over the last 4 years, we've taken very seriously that if people are going to remain as members and vital members of this congregation, it will be because of the connections that they make here. And so the membership committee is looking at how is it that we integrate people as they come in? How is it that we help people to connect with various aspects of the congregation life? And how is it that we help people to remain connected with the congregation? And that's enormous. Another aspect that's come out of this whole thing is an adult religious education program that has probably changed the congregation more than any other adult program we've ever had, and that's the Harvest the Power program, which is a very in-depth process in which members of the congregation, some of whom have volunteered and some of whom have been invited, undergo an exploration of the traditions of this congregation and of our larger religious movement, as well as leadership orientation that over the last 4 years have changed the way even that things go with our nominating and leadership development committee, to the point of searching for people who might be willing to be on the board of trustees, to having to winnow down the number of volunteers of people who want to serve in those larger capacities. Phenomenal change in the way we do business. If I were able to address the interim minister coming in, I would want them to not know terribly much, because I would want them to learn it with the leadership and with the members of the congregation in ways that would cause the leadership and membership to articulate things to the interim minister, so that that minister could be helpful in making evident the things that are more tacit. But the one thing that I would want forgiveness from the interim minister for is the way in which over 20 years' time some in-house things have become overly comfortable, and those are going to be challenges that they will need to face on behalf of the settled minister that will follow the interim. And an example that I would give of that is a number of years ago, I tried very hard to try to bring in the way that we do our remembrances, our joys and concerns during the worship service, recognizing that that is so clearly one of the areas that is a barometer of congregations' willingness to grow. And we tried and we did not succeed in changing that pattern. And I'm hoping that the interim minister will be able to come in and, in a very good-natured way, work with the congregation in experimenting with different ways of accomplishing remembrances. I would own that as my biggest sin, and it's not the congregation's fault, it's my fault, and I leave that to you, interim minister, to work with the congregation on finding a way that allows this congregation to remain true to heart and a way to step into the future that they want. Here's what I would want the settled minister to know coming in to this congregation. Way to go. You've come through an incredible process to be here. The congregation has come through an incredible process in order for you to be here. I have to imagine that that the discernment process you went through in order to be at this point is one that has allowed you to know that the history of this congregation is one in which so many things are evident, but three things that I would just hold up for you, and one of those is that in this congregation there are two things because I'm going to marry two things. There are two things that I would want you to know from the history that you've probably already discerned, but I would hold them up. And first among them is that this congregation has learned incredibly well to marry the need, the personal and communal need of the dynamics of spirituality with justice. And the marriage of spirituality and justice have created a character of religion in this congregation that go all the way back to 1897 when this congregation was formed and throughout every decade ever since. The second piece that I would hold up for you is that the level of intellect, the level of commitment, the level of expertise, the level of artistry in this congregation is higher than I have experienced in any other congregation, whether I was visiting that congregation or whether I have been minister to that congregation. And you have been called yourself to be the best minister you can possibly be. And by being in that environment, it's made much more easy to accomplish for you. And I would just hold that up for you to know. I would like to talk about this congregation as a teaching congregation for a moment. And by way of that, I would say that I know that a fundraiser is underway to create a permanent endowment so that this congregation will, on an every other year basis, be able to fund an intern minister line in the budget. And I just want to, for whoever might be observing this video, to encourage you to give gobs of money to that so that it can happen, so that the principal will never have to be touched and will be able to take interest out in order to support such a budget line. Having said that, what I would want you to know is that this congregation over the years has turned out incredible ministers. Going back to my first years here, we ordained John Tolley, who had been a director of religious education. We ordained him, he left, and he was minister of religious education up at Westport, Connecticut. Former president of our congregation, Craig Hirschberg, was ordained by this congregation very early on in my tenure here. Early as well was the 2-year part-time internship of Rosemary Bray McNatt and her ordination that occurred here. And Rosemary has gone on now after a long ministry at Fourth Universalist in the city to being the president of Starr King School for the Ministry out in Berkeley, California. Cheryl Walker was an intern minister here and had a wonderful internship with our congregation and was ordained at All Souls, but we were a part of that with her. And she's now serving a congregation down in the Carolinas. Wendy Pantoja, who now serves a congregation in Miami, Florida, did her internship with us. Since I've been here in the last 20 years, members of the congregation going on to seek ordination include Jan Carlson Bull, Susan McGinn, David Messner, and recently we have as students Kimberly Johnson and Terry Cummings, Barnaby Feeder as well. You know, one other thing I would want to hold up for the congregation, because I don't think very many people are aware of this, but in terms of their being supportive of the future of Unitarian Universalist ministry, is that during my tenure here, I have mentored many students and new ministers both that have not been a part of our congregational life in any way. Currently, I'm mentoring 5 different new UU ministers, and you know, over the 2 decades here, there have been dozens, and the congregation, by supporting me, has supported that ministry as well. When I first came here, I'm looking, you cannot see it, but I'm looking at the pulpit. When I first came here, the desk on the pulpit here for this congregation was about this wide. And I came from a congregation where I could actually lay out 8 sheets of 8.5 by 11 paper without them touching each other on the desk of the pulpit. And this was not large enough for 2 pieces to be there. And before I could preach my first sermon, I built the new desktop. And I had recovered a big old oak desk at home and had some leftover materials. And so from the very same piece of oak that covers my desktop at home, I bring my sermon and preach it from a desktop made of the same materials that has been here and in place since my first week here. Let me talk about the building for just a moment and the changes that it's gone through in the last 20 years. When I came, the facilities were in reasonably good condition. I didn't look at anything and think, oh my. But over those first few years, the building started to show some wear, and there were a number of places in the ceiling here where plaster was beginning to fall. And members of the congregation, leadership of the congregation, began to recognize that we needed to have a capital campaign and we needed to take care of the facilities that had been left to us for the people of the future. And so Chris Corbett, Nancy Felix, Janice Maffei, and I met for a year. We called ourselves the Gang of Four, and we were the core elements. And then we brought in a consultant, Michael Evers, and then brought in quite a number of people who had been in leadership and were currently in leadership in the congregation, and had an enormously successful capital campaign where we raised just over $1 million. And you know, not only did we bring the facilities back up to what they needed to be, but we brought them beyond, so that we were really stepping into the future. Under the guidance of David Lewis and Karen Nielsen-Fried, a designer was brought in, and you know, our sanctuary for years had been white walls and overly lacquered wood, and a new vision for what this space might look like came into being through David and Karen and the designer that they had brought in. And so they reached back into Unitarian history and came up with the connections with Frank Lloyd Wright and with the arts and crafts movement that this building was based on, and came up with color schemes that came out of that movement and transformed what had been a very lovely sanctuary into what I find a stunningly beautiful sanctuary. And there were a number of longtime members of the congregation that struggled with that for a while, and Gene Nowak, who is one of my favorite people on the entire planet, continues to struggle with it a little bit, but most people came to appreciate the beauty that is so rich in the new design. And I have not ever walked into this room with a person seeing it for the first time where they don't catch their breath and say, "Isn't this something?" Another one of those idiosyncratic pieces for me is when the lights are on in the room and I'm looking out, one of the most attractive pieces to me in the whole scheme of things is the grill work in front of the organ pipes up in the choir loft. When the lights are on up there, it is just stunningly beautiful because it brings in all of the elements of the design that are throughout the rest of the room. You know, some people might know that these chairs, the chairs that we have here in the sanctuary, were made for this sanctuary. The lines of the chairs match the lines of the rest of the architecture in the room. And when it came time we had to do something because the chairs were falling into outrageous disrepair. And when those chairs had been initially bought in the year 1905, we found the receipt, and they cost $1.68 per pair for those chairs. And we priced out having them refurbished, which meant every stick of wood being removed from every other stick of wood, everything totally coming apart, the iron parts, some of them being remanufactured and so forth. And it ended up costing something in the neighborhood of $1,100 to repair each pair of chairs. And the congregation decided that indeed it was worth preserving that history because we can build a good future on a solid history. And not only the history, but the original integrity of the design of the room was saved as a result of that incredible investment. I would like to say something about how this congregation has helped to shape who I am, and I will do that without, I hope, getting terribly emotional about it.
Good luck.
But
I've seen attempts at that.
Members of the congregation know that, and I tell every new class of new UUs that I'm a sap and that people have just grown used to that. But, what I would want the congregation to know is that, as I spoke about those formational pieces of our shared ministry, those were not just formational pieces of our shared ministry. They were formational pieces in my life. And what the congregation has done for me is to fulfill a quote by 19th century Unitarian minister Eleanor Gordon, a quote that I used on my ordination invitations. It was the theme of my ordination way back when I was ordained, and is on emails that go out from either of my computers, a quote that says that we were given life to find its meaning. And what the congregation has done for me is it has provided me cause and reward. The days and the weeks and the months following September 11th were a challenge for any of us in this country, and I say especially in this area, to find and make meaning. How do we respond to the heinousness of those acts, and how do we respond to the desolation of a history that had encouraged us to think that we were immune? And what happened in those days and weeks and months to follow was that the congregation looked to me to see how I was making sense of those things. And had I not been here, I would not have even attempted to make sense of how my life connected to those things. But by being here, I had no choice but to connect my life to those events in a way that allowed others to connect them to their lives. And I think that in that experience, there was a shift in my ministry here that caused me to know that no matter what I was doing, that was what I was doing. That I was connecting my life to the events of our day in ways that helped, I hoped, others to be able to connect theirs. One of the great blessings in being in a ministry as long as this one has been is the front end of it, in which I get to meet people who have been here, people who had been here for a very long time. You know, there's a whole generation that's older than me, and I'm afraid so many of them have been lost since I've been here. But and I don't, you know, I'm afraid in naming names just because of all the names that I would leave off. But you know, one of the names that I can hold up, because she was the president of the congregation when I arrived, and if ever I had a question at all about the history of the congregation, I could turn to Nancy Knertzer, who was third generation in her family member of this congregation. She was the president when I came. She was the chief historian of putting together the centennial history back in 1997, and someone with whom I just became so close to. You know, I would be on the phone with Nancy all the time. Okay, two quick Nancy Knertzer stories. One is that she was president when I came. She wasn't altogether sure when I first arrived if she was going to, just how she was going to take to this new minister coming down from Massachusetts, yada yada. And so she asked me early on. She said, "So how long do you think you might want to be the minister here in Montclair?" And I said, I don't know. I'm thinking maybe 10 years. I want to see my children all the way through their primary and secondary education, and I'm thinking maybe 10 years. Nancy called me on my 10th anniversary and said, "You may not leave." And you know, I was amazed that she remembered the conversation, and she was amazed that I thought she might have forgotten it. The other story is that Nancy was really in her deathbed a few years back when I left to take my bicycle riding tour across the country. And we knew that when I said goodbye, that it would be our last goodbye. And she wanted me to know that she was thrilled that I was leaving to ride my bicycle across the country. You know, neither of us knew at that time, but I was in touch by telephone with Chris. She died at home. I was in touch with her daughters, Chris and Lee, as that process was going on. And the last 36, 48 hours were just really pretty rough. And in the end, Lee held the phone up to Nancy's ear, and I was able to say goodbye to her one more time. And then, as Lee told me later on, it was only moments after that Nancy had died. So she's someone in particular who I will always hold in my heart, but she's also an iconic representation of so many from that generation who have been such stalwart, wonderful members of this congregation, and who I have had the great pleasure of being in relationship with. I want to give you a little bit of history about the name change. And the history is that there had been an attempt to change the name of the congregation from the Unitarian Church of Montclair during the interim ministry that preceded my arrival here. And wisely, people decided to wait until the new minister got here. Well, I got here and I said, there is no way in the world I'm going to attach myself to this effort in my first year of ministry here. That would be, foolhardy for me and for the congregation. And there was something put before the congregation, and it needed by the bylaws for something that large, it needed a 2/3 majority, and it did not get that. But only by a few votes did it not get that. But fortunately, Fortunately, really, it took more time. And I was always for the change to Unitarian Universalist and congregation, all of those changes. At Montclair, I can take or leave. But Unitarian Universalist congregation was something that I absolutely was always for. And so I would bring that up with my new UU classes over the years and wonder when it was going to re-emerge in the ethos of things. And then you, Jerry Freed, and a number of other people picked it up finally about 10 years ago and conducted what I felt was one of the most thorough processes of transformation that could have occurred around a name change, so that, you know, going from more than a third of the congregation being against changing a name in the previous vote, because of the thoroughness, because everyone in the end felt that they had been heard, because of the efficacy and intention in changing the name. By the time we got down to the vote, my recollection is that there was not a single no vote. There were maybe 3 or 4 abstentions, but that we were ready to move into the future with a new name that took into account both sides of our tradition, as well as taking into account naming ourselves as an institution that was non-sectarian, that was Unitarian Universalist and a religious society by being a congregation rather than by coming down a particular sectarian tradition. If there was a single person in the congregation who felt that they had not been part of the conversation about the name change, that could only have been true if they had attempted to not be in the conversation. Everyone in every way possible was invited through so many group processes to be a part of that conversation. They had to try not to be a part of it if they weren't. As to the diversity of the congregation, one of the things that occurred to me when I came here, when I learned that a number of our African American members who had been part of the congregation under Norman Fletcher and even before that, Dr. Weirs, was that in the 60s, when there was a Black Power movement and when it was made very uncomfortable for certain members of our congregation to not be members of African American congregations in town by being here, we lost a good number of our members that were African American. And the theory that I had was that African Americans had been invited into this congregation to become a part of this Western European legacy that we are, that they'd been invited to come in and be a part of the classicist pulpit, the classic music, that was all very Western European, and they had not been invited to come in and be a part of a congregation that was transforming by their participation in it. And so I went out and I tested that with Marjorie Baskerville and a couple of other people, but Marjorie I remember most, sitting down and talking with her because she had been one of the people that had left. And I asked Marjorie about that, and she said, yes, that's exactly why I left, and I understand that things are different there now, and I'm coming back. And she had heard of the work of our Undoing Racism Committee and what was going on in the congregation. And Marjorie came back, and she was 8th row back, 2nd seat in from the side aisle from that day until the day she died, except for the few Sundays that she was out of town or traveling. And what I learned about diversity in the congregation through that, and what I think the congregation learned about it, is yes, we have to be inviting of persons of color or otherwise marginalized people who are part of marginalized cultures in our society. We have to be very inviting. We have to be ready to welcome them when they come here. But much more than that, we have to be aware of who we are, each of us, in relationship with people, so that we're not stepping on what we're trying to do by our own biases and bigotries that we continue in their presence. We have to be self-analytical in terms of the privilege that we bring into here. And I think that this congregation has paid very close attention to the privilege that it holds, and as a result of that attention, we've been able to become more diverse. The marriage equality movement started a long time before marriage equality was achieved, and this congregation was a part of that from the very beginning. In the early days, it was the Lambda Society that was at the forefront, and this congregation was heavily involved in the Lambda Society. So we were involved in the project of Love Makes a Family, the photo essay that traveled around the country, and we were instrumental in the beginnings of that. It was, that was done through Verizon, so from the very earliest days of my ministry here, the congregation has been, from before the days of my ministry here, the congregation has been engaged in gay and lesbian rights, and then in the transition to marriage equality. And as a result of that, gay and lesbian families, head of families, have been able to bring their families here, knowing that this was a safe place for them to be, knowing that this was a place where their children could get the spiritual nurturance that they needed without the bigotry and the bias that they might find in other places in the community. So here we are in the sanctuary, and I want to show you a few things that always stick out to me here in the sanctuary, beginning with the plaque to Paul Gannett Osborne. So Paul Gannett Osborne was the first American to be killed in World War I, the Great War, the war to end all wars. And interestingly, two historical connections beyond that Paul Gannett Osborne was a member of the congregation. One is his relationship to William Channing Gannett, the great Unitarian minister, and two is the outcome of World War I was a significant one on Unitarianism and Universalism, in that a response at the end of the war was in 1933 the Humanist Manifesto that created really the much more humanistically orientation of both Unitarianism and Universalism since that time. On the opposite wall from our war hero from World War I is our peace site plaque. Our congregation voted to dedicate our space as a peace site on May the 27th, 1984, and it has been since. This was made by a local artist who was the clerk of Montclair Township for many years. So our congregation has a 118-year history of dedication to social justice kinds of issues. But in 1984, that justice took on peace as a major element, and so has informed the congregation ever since then about who we are when our nation is in conflict. Also who we are in terms of the way that we are civil with one another and with those around us. Early in my tenure here, we had a renter who rented our Fletcher Hall and was a karate teacher. And we learned that he used mock guns as part of his class. And guns are one of the things that in the peace site are not allowable. And when we were unable to back down from that position because of our values, he then had to leave. And so we paid for this value in a number of different ways. As we walk through the sanctuary, we see how beautiful it is. For over 100 years, this space was, while it was beautiful, was all white with heavy, dark lacquered wood that got darker and darker through the decades as new coats of varnish was put on it. And back 8 years ago, Karen Nielsen-Fried and David Lewis engaged an architectural designer who came in and really picked up on the Frank Lloyd Wright aspect of this arts and crafts design and came up with this beautiful, beautiful way of presenting our sacred space that we worship in. I don't know how well they'll come out on the video, but you might see the tie rods that span from side to side here. Back in 1917, when the fire occurred and the timbers came falling down and charred the floor, and the roof was totally gone, the walls of the sanctuary began to spread out because there was nothing to hold them in place. And so before they could rebuild the roof, they had to pull the walls back together. And so they drilled through these timbers, and it looks like these bars stop where you see them go into the wood, but actually they continue on more than 3 feet to the exterior of the building where there's a plate, and they actually pulled the walls back together with those bars, those tie rods, and the plates on the outside, and they continue to hold the structure solid even with the roof on it. Probably more so because the reason that the roof burned off was that it was a cedar shingle roof, and now it's a very heavy clay tile roof, and so there's an awful lot of weight that's being supported up there by these walls. You know, the beauty of this space, going back to the design, came about. Janice Maffei was our president. Nancy Felix and Chris Corbett and I met as the co-conspirators in developing a plan for a capital campaign. We met for about a year, and then the campaign was underway with a large crew of people participating in it. So here we are in the chancel area of the sanctuary, and well, let's start with the pulpit. I get into the pulpit on Sunday mornings, and on Sundays where there's something particularly weighty perhaps going on, or something of a historical nature, I personally invoke the memories of Edgar Weirs and of Norman Fletcher and of Lee Barker, who is still with us, by the way. Norman and Edgar are gone, but Lee is still with us as president of Meadville Lombard. But I invoke the spirit and the memory of those predecessors of mine before stepping into the pulpit. One of the things when I first arrived here was that there's actually a very small desk for the papers underneath here. It's only large enough for just an 8.5 by 11 with a little bit of extra space. So the first thing I did when I came was I built this new desktop to put over the old one, and I built it from some leftover wood that I re-topped my office desk at home with. So I would work on my sermons there on that piece of oak and bring it here to more of the oak from the same cut. The gong that we use to begin and end each service is actually has an interesting story as well. I originally had a set of chimes that was a gift that was given to me when I was ordained, and over the early years here, those chimes were knocked over so many times and became so broken, and eventually there wasn't enough left to ring them, and the last person to break them, I'll leave his name out of this, but he wanted to take responsibility for it, so he found a place down in Kentucky that would fix it, and we sent it down there, and after we sent it, the artisan who did it moved from one studio to another and lost the chimes altogether, so we replaced it with the singing bowl, and it's been here ever since. Here's the beautiful chancel. You know, a story that I would like to share, especially because it's important right now, is that long time member Malcolm Campbell of our congregation was such a generous donor for so many different things in the congregation. And after we did the work on the room, what we found was that the upper area of the chancel was so noisy when people walked across it that we needed a piece of carpet for it, and we wanted to match the carpeting that we'd put in the rest of the sanctuary. And so I went to Malcolm and I asked him if he would be willing to make a donation to cover the cost of the carpet. And Malcolm's response is, well, I'd rather do something that would help people. And it was only when I convinced him that it would be helpful to people that he said, okay, then I'm happy to pay for the carpet, which was not an inexpensive item by any means. Oh, another little story. We have the drop screen here that we use in every service. When we had the capital campaign, one of the areas where we got a little bit tight in expending money was on the screen, and we bought a screen that took 2 people about an hour to set up and to set down, and so it became impractical to use that during the service because we didn't want to block this beautiful space. And so I asked if we might be able to get a drop screen, and it just did not fit into the financial needs of the congregation at the time. So after a little bit, I thought, well, we need a drop screen, so I'll pay for it. So I went ahead and bought it, and I hung it up there, and two things happened. One was I was approached and said, now, we can't actually leave it there. We'll have to find some permanent way of hanging it. And I said, absolutely, that's fine. You can hang it however you'd like, whenever you want. And so it's still in the original place where it was hung. And not too many months after we put it up, the board came to me and said, yes, you were right. We needed to have a drop screen. We're delighted to have it. And they paid back the money that I had spent on the drop screen. So this space altogether in this room is a space that is sacred to the congregation because it's where we come together for worship. It's where, whatever we do, wherever we are, it's about finding and making meaning in our lives and in the world around us. But this room is one that we come together in, especially for that purpose. But this room is used for many other purposes. One of the ways that we find and make meaning as a congregation is by finding and making meaning in the larger community. And so we open our space for uses by many different groups within the community, so that on a Friday night, we might have Outpost in the Burbs here, and we've had so many different performers. A couple of times, the congregation itself brought Richie Havens in, and we had fundraisers that Richie starred in. So we have Outpost in the Burbs, we have Blue Wave that comes in and meets here. When the marriage equality movement was alive and going, Garden State Equality was a group that held many meetings here. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had an opera in here with over 70 members in the opera company, and the cast and the orchestra fit in, and still there was room for 180 members of the audience. Last week we had our 6th annual concert for Haiti, and there are so many groups that come in, and we want our space to be available for those purposes because we want to be a place for the community to be at home in, and for the community to come together to create stronger and better community. So we might want to spend just a second here in the room that is known only as the minister's study, although there are other things that happen here as well. Leslie Traywin, who is the daughter of Don and Mara Lee Traywin, grew up in this congregation. Leslie's a little younger than I am, but not all that much. Uses this room as a room where she sees therapy patients as well. And so we have some Don Traywin artwork that's in here. But this was the office for both Edgar Weirs and for Norman Fletcher. And the legend is that, the legend which I believe to be a very true story, is that the building that's outside of here did not exist at the time that this was Edgar's office. And the view was clear across the street to the playground where the children would gather. And it was looking out of this window, first of all, that Norman had the inspiration that the playground was needed altogether because the kids were just out there playing. But then it was years later when he was looking out on that playground and saw many African American children that were playing with white kids there, and realized that if we wanted to integrate our congregation, a way of doing that would be to invite those children of color to be a part of our programs here. And so looking out the window, he had that wonderful idea. He walked over, he invited the kids to come into the congregation for our religious education, and of course those parents of those kids were not going to allow them to come without coming as well. And so this congregation was integrated in Montclair decades before other congregations even began to think about the value of integration. When we had our capital campaign, one of the goals, one of the large goals of the campaign, was to become much more accessible. And so this elevator that goes up and down these 5 stairs was put in place. We've had some challenges with it over the years, but it really has made our facilities much more accessible, and there are a number of people who appreciate its being here, and I think as a result of that, the congregation appreciates its being here because we're not being exclusive based on accessibility needs. You might say that this is a room that represents where this congregation began. So here we are in the Alliance Room, and you might say that this is a reflection of where this congregation began, because all of you students of the history of the Unitarian Universalist congregation at Montclair know that it was begun by a group of women who formed under the name of the Women's Alliance and started the religious education program that then became this congregation a few years later. And this is the Alliance Room. When our Alliance went out of existence a few years back, they took the remaining money that they had and bought this beautiful furniture, not for themselves because they were no longer going to be here, but for those who were going to come after them. And up until that time of their disbandment, their disbanding, the Women's Alliance was, as a group, responsible for the largest contributions to the congregation of any group through the thrift store that they ran downstairs over in the annex for many decades. You'll see the portraits of Edgar Weirs and Norman Fletcher, portrait of myself by Paul Weingarten. David Lewis is currently working on a portrait that will remain when I have left. I want to draw your attention over here, though, because this is a group of women that when I think of the Women's Alliance, these are many of the women that I think of. And so many of these women have died since I've been here. We still have some of them left, I'm so pleased to say. Pauline Davis is still with us. Jean Nowak is still with us. Phyllis Workinger is still with us. And Elsa New is still with us. And everyone else who's pictured here is gone. This is a picture of Ellen Studiford and Emily Kennedy. Ellen Studiford was the first woman president of our congregation. Emily Kennedy was a president of the congregation some years later than that, and they were very close friends. They lived just a couple of blocks from each other, both of them having died in their homes some years ago. A picture of Nancy Knertzer, who was second generation born in this congregation, died in 2008. She was the president when I came, and I don't know that we're going to be able to go downstairs and look in that space because of the preschool that's down there right now. But Nancy Knertzer grew up as this congregation was growing up. She died at the age of 83 in 2008, and she tells lots of stories, some that would make a minister's hair curl about things that the youth group did, but she talks about how in 1955 the building was sitting on the ground and the congregation elected to excavate in order to have a basement for Sunday school classes, and how for a year they all had great fun when the construction crew wasn't here, going around and crawling around in the basement under the jacks and the pylons and things that were holding the building up. And now, all these decades later, we have that wonderful religious education space that's used during the week as a preschool area, which is a good rental for us, but also an excellent service for the larger community. So here we are in Fletcher Hall. Over the decades, so many things have happened in here. On the stage here, there have been plays. Off and on through the decades, there have been theater groups that have come and gone. We currently have just an excellent theater group. Over the decades, there have been musical performances. This has been the site of many classical all the classical to rock to jazz to every conceivable genre of music that has taken place for concert goers in this room. One of my favorite things, besides Sunday coffee hour, the holy sacrament of coffee hour that takes place in this room every week, but beyond that, one of my favorite things that happens in here is wedding receptions. Brides and grooms who are members of the congregation or those who rent our space often will come in and decorate this in such festive ways, and it's just always a joy to be in it when it's like that, and it's wonderful to be in it when it's not like that as well, because it's such beautiful space. One of the things that happens in Fletcher Hall that is, again, a great reflection of this congregation's service to the larger community is that every Wednesday night, this hall is filled with tables, and our Mesh Cafe takes place here. Mesh Cafe is our congregation's participation in the community's Mesh program that feeds people in different houses of worship every night of the week. And so in this room, on any given Wednesday night, we will be feeding between 55 and I think the largest numbers we've gone up to 80 or 85 people that we're serving. We have anywhere from 15 to a couple of dozen volunteers from our congregation who come in and cook the meal in the kitchen and then bring it out and serve it to our guests. And we're talking about an intergenerational event, because we have children who are working oftentimes with their parents or with friends that come in, that are part of the cooking, that are part of the serving, that are part of sitting down at the table and visiting with the guests. Our congregation serves more meals in our Mesh Cafe than all of the other sites do put together. This is where the homeless and the hungry of Montclair want to come to be fed, because they are so incredibly welcomed here. It's just a great, wonderful thing. So here at the end of Fletcher Hall is the Melcher Library. It's named for Marguerite and Frederick Melcher, who, by the way, are well known throughout the Unitarian Universalist world. They were Unitarians in their time. It was before the merger, and there's a Melcher Award. The Melchers were very influential in the national movement of Unitarian, especially of Unitarianism, and so this is our library. It's an honor system library. There's no signing anything out, and I would say that most of what we lend out comes back, and my suspicion is that when things don't come back when they've been lent out, that probably they're passed on to others. So and we have a number of people who give regularly, really excellent texts to the library. So this bulletin board went up a few years ago, and a number of different organizations within the congregation are represented on the bulletin boards on both sides of the hall here. I don't know that I talked about the legislative ministries the other day, and the Unitarian Universalist Legislative Ministries of New Jersey was formed just a few years ago. Our congregation has been involved since before it was an actual body. We were involved in the structuring of it. I served on the board. Members of our congregation have served and are serving on the board. Former president of our congregation, Craig Hirschberg, is currently the executive director. Nick Lewis, Judy Strachan are currently on the board, members of our congregation that are on the board of UULMNJ. It's an organization of all of the UU congregations within the state of New Jersey in order to take our religious values into the public square so that there is a voice that affirms and promotes the inherent worth and dignity of every individual that's a part of the political conversation in New Jersey, so that we are in respect of and promote the interdependent web of existence of which we are a part, and so that value is there as a part of the political life of the state of New Jersey, because there's a legislative ministry that this congregation is a part of and supports. I've mentioned the fire. a few different times. The roof burned off, and as it was burning, it fell in. And you might notice on the floor here the char marks, and they're throughout, especially this side of the sanctuary. There's some over on the other side too, but you can see them much more distinctly. They're everywhere here, where the timbers fell and burnt some of the floorboards as well. Here's a really good example here. And it's sort of for me, it's a note of history that's just a part of everything. It's one of the reasons why I take such great pains every Christmas Eve at the candlelight service to make sure that everybody knows the proper behavior to use with candles, so that we don't have new char marks on the floor that we might one day, or that future generations might one day celebrate. So there are three things I'd like to talk about a little bit here in the narthex. The first is the Memorial Garden plaque that's over here. The Memorial Garden itself is just right outside of these windows, and here are the names of members of the congregation whose ashes are in that garden. The garden didn't exist until 2000. It might have been 1999 when the garden came into existence. Doris Langsdorff was in 1999. Luella Barclay was the first ashes that went into the garden, and she died in 1997. So that was the inauguration of our memorial garden. And an interesting thing was that when she died, her daughter asked me if the ashes of her two dogs that had been on her mantle for some number of years could go into the same hole in the garden that we were putting Luella's ashes. And so from the very beginning, we've had both human and animals loved by humans ash remains in our garden. Another thing that I would like to point out is our welcoming congregation poster that's here. This is not a very beautiful presentation, but what it represents is a lot of years of self-examination in terms of homophobia and what we need to do in order to be self-aware of our own participation in it, and what we need to do in order to be more welcoming of the gay, lesbian, transgender, and bisexual communities here at home, and what we can do to promote those things in the world around us, and an expression of our being a welcoming congregation with the many years of dedication that this congregation had towards marriage equality. I didn't realize that the Green Sanctuary certificate was over here. This was, we began the process in February of 2001 to become a Green Sanctuary congregation. We were finally made it through all of the process by 2010, and our commitment to sustainability and to being an ecologically responsible congregation has only grown since 2010. So I see that as a movement within the congregation that will continue. We're in the midst of our pledge drive now, and we have this marker up here, but I want to take it away for just a minute because there's a painting on the mantle here that says a great deal, I think, about our congregation. It says that we are welcoming of all seekers after truth, beauty, justice, and compassion. Those were words that we began saying 20 years ago. And when I said them the first time, the way that I said them was that we are welcoming of all seekers after truth, beauty, justice, and compassion, recognizing our diversity of race, age, gender, sexual identity, orientation, and religious background. And Nancy Knutzer, who was the president at that time, said to me shortly after, "Can we do that a little bit differently?" She said, "Do we want to do something more than recognize, something more even than to accept or to tolerate? Can't we celebrate those differences?" And so for 20 years ever since then, we say, celebrating our diversity of race, age, gender, sexual identity, and orientation, religious background, and perspective on life. Nancy also ended that last piece, the perspective on life. One of the challenges during the Capitol campaign was we knew that we needed to light the room better for people. And so coming up with this arrangement for lights and utilizing the area that was already broken up by the tie rods, the designers, David and Karen especially, wanted to minimize the intrusion on the view from up here, and it was sort of impossible. But when most people who are up here are sitting down like this, and sitting down you can easily see under the light racks, and the people down below can see much better as a result of those light racks. When I'm sitting on the chancel or standing on the chancel, sometimes when we're singing, and I look up and I see this grill work in front of the organ pipes, I just get a feeling of being at home. And it's just such a warm, rich feeling that just holds me. And I love being held in that space. So here we are in Unity Gallery. This has been here now for about 2.5 years, created by Karen Freed and David Lewis. And most typically, the room is filled with works of art. Every February, for the last couple of years, we have included an African American display of some sort or another for Black History Month. And this year we're celebrating Black inventors. And so we have a number of pieces about African American men and women who invented and developed various products and projects that have changed the culture of the country. Inventors. During other times, Unity Gallery is filled with artwork, sometimes from members of our congregation, sometimes from members of the wider community, and it has brought all kinds of people into our facilities to see the various exhibits that have taken place here, and it's been just a wonderful addition to the congregation's life in these last few years. Just passing through. So it almost never fails that when somebody comes into my office for the first time, they look around at all of this beautiful artwork and they say, "Oh, what a great office." And I feel like that every single time I walk into this room. I love my office and I love the artwork. Almost every piece here was something that was given to me by the artist who created it. Back in 1995, this was given to me by a 14-year-old girl who was a member of the congregation, and it was an ink design that she did for Let It Be a Dance, a song that maybe some members of the congregation remember. A piece by David Lewis. This is a piece that was not given to me, but I got to be the custodian of it. This is a watercolor of our facilities that was done by Nat Lewis. This was a collage that was done by Edmund Pease on the occasion of my installation. Paul Weingarten did the piece up above here. Sharon Pitts gave me this as a gift for having done her son's memorial service, a graveside memorial service that took place on September the 12th, 2001. A very difficult day. A piece by Don Traywin, a photograph by Gene Campbell. A gift from the Stockton, Illinois congregation, who gave me this piece from the Book of Ecclesiastes. Some recognitions. This is my fellowship material from the Unitarian Universalist Association. This is a recognition that came out of the New Jersey General Assembly. This is one of my prized possessions here. At first glance it looks like a letter that I've written, and most of it is, but in the hand scrawl up here is the response to the letter that was handwritten by President Jimmy Carter. I did a sermon based on one of his books a few years ago and sent him a copy of it, and he wrote back, "To Rev. Ortman, thank you. It's a fine, It's a fine and much-needed sermon. Best wishes, Jimmy C. I have my bicycle helmet on the wall here, and the reason that I have it there is so that people might ask about it when they come into my office. That's the helmet that I was wearing when I went crashing to the ground on my cross-country ride a few years ago, and that helmet saved my life. And I want to tell everybody I have the opportunity, wear a helmet. It can save your life. Different photographs of different moments in time, and just a wonderful space to work and to work with people. I want to talk about the style of ministry that we have shared over the past 20 years a little bit. And the way that I want to talk about that is by saying that, let me start off by putting it in words that I often share with the mentees that I've worked with over the years. And what I always stress to them over and over through our time together is that ministry, when it's done well, is never about the minister, and I think that has been the hallmark of our shared ministry here in Montclair. I think that we've done ministry incredibly well together. The various presidents of the congregation and I have felt like partners in work. I felt like partners with the board over the years. I feel like we have an understanding of the terrain that we are responsible for, and I understand that that my part of that is to be. This is a phrase I just heard this morning: the spiritual custodian of the congregation, and it's the board's task to make sure that the structures, in their many forms, from physical to financial to the relationships among the congregants, are solid. And so together we've created year-round worship services. Together we've created the small group ministries. We've created the visiting chaplains group. Together we've created a membership committee finally that really looks at how we bring people into the congregation and how we maintain the structures that allow people to be connected here. And that all sounds like very general work, and in a lot of ways it is. And so it's real hard to put your hand on a particular piece and say, this is why it's worked well. There are so many pieces for why we have enjoyed such a wonderful tenure together, so my hope is that the new search committee will do diligent work and find the minister who will continue to serve this congregation in ways that allows this congregation to continue to become itself in ever more meaningful ways. So a way that I would want to put all of what we've been talking about into the larger context of Unitarian Universalism and where it is today is to say that, is to start really with the traditional aspects of both of those traditions, of both of those faith communities. So that, from Earl Morse Wilbur, we have the three major characteristics of Unitarianism that have existed before the movement became Unitarian, and that is freedom of conscience, religious tolerance, and the application of reason. So those have been a part of Unitarianism since before it was Unitarian. And then from the historian Charles Howe, on the Universalist side of things, we have this incredibly hopeful, optimistic faith tradition that says that we are all saved in the end. And so it's incumbent upon us to behave with one another with that as the base, that we are all saved. And so the way that comes into play today is, our Unitarian Universalist movement, based in those very characteristics, was incredibly involved in the marriage equality movement and continues to be. I mean, we talk about it in past tense here in New Jersey because we've achieved it. There's still a lot of states out there where it has yet to be achieved, and Unitarian Universalists are actively engaged in those states, and they need to continue to be. This year, we've had the Trayvon Martin case, we've had the Michael Brown case, we've had the Eric Garner case and so many other cases where African American men are being killed by civilians and police in ways that their killers are being held totally unaccountable, and the systems are being totally left unaccountable for those murders. And Unitarian Universalists are taking to the streets once again, because that's where we go when society needs to be reminded that things are askew. That's where we go, and we're back in the streets again. We were there, we were there in the Vietnam War. We've been there through the first Iraq War, through the second Iraq War, and we continue. And now we're there because racial injustice is once again something that has become intolerable, and so we're there. Where we need to go even more is in the area of the environment. Yes, there's a great deal of activism within Unitarian Universalism in regard to the environment, but there needs to be a great deal more, and I think that we need to take to the streets to say to our larger culture, we are spending our grandchildren's, our great-grandchildren's inheritance in ways that can never be made up. And we have to change the way that we are in the world. We have to change the way that we relate to the world, by the way that we relate to one another and the world. This is all about oppression. This is all about justice. And in the end, it's about having an environment. And Unitarian Universalism needs to, more than we have, step up to that plate.